Ezekiel Thornfield's hands shook as he read the final entry in the leather diary. Blood stained the yellowed pages where desperate words ended mid-sentence. They found me. If anyone reads this, please find my baby. Please tell her I loved her more than. The ink trailed off into nothing. Outside the abandoned cabin, wind howled through broken shutters like the cry of a woman in pain. Zeke had lived alone in these Colorado mountains for 8 years, but he had never felt loneliness cut this deep. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. 3 days earlier, Zeke had stumbled into this cabin during the worst blizzard he'd seen in years. Snow fell so thick, he couldn't see his own boots. His beard was frozen solid with ice, and his fingers were turning blue despite his thick gloves. The cabin door hung open, creaking in the wind like a death rattle. Inside, dust covered everything except one small table where the diary lay open, as if someone had just been writing in it moments before. Zeke was a simple man who trapped animals and traded furs. He couldn't read well, but something about the elegant handwriting drew him in. The first page made his heart stop. My name is Serafina Blackwood. I am 22 years old, and I am running for my life. If something happens to me, I need the world to know the truth about what I saw Cornelius Grimsby do. For 2 days, Zeke read every word. Serafina's story unfolded like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. She had witnessed a murder that shook him to his core. A young railroad worker named Timothy had discovered that Grimsby was stealing land from native tribes by forging government documents. When Timothy threatened to expose the truth, Grimsby shot him in cold blood, then threw his body into the river like trash. But that wasn't the worst part. Serafina was 3 months pregnant when she witnessed the murder. She wasn't just running to save herself. She was running to save her unborn child from a man who would kill anyone to protect his secrets. Each diary entry showed her growing weaker, more desperate, more afraid. She wrote about sleeping in caves, eating berries, and hiding from men with guns who tracked her like a wild animal. Zeke had lost his own wife and baby daughter to fever 5 years ago. Reading Serafina's words about protecting her child brought back memories that still made him wake up screaming. But something else burned in his chest now. Rage. Pure, white-hot rage at the men who hunted a pregnant woman like she was prey. The diary's final pages revealed Serafina's clever plan. She had left false clues for her hunters while secretly heading to Sacred Bear Rock, a place the local Cheyenne tribe considered holy ground. She believed they might protect her there. But the blood on the last page told a different story. They had found her first. Zeke closed the diary and walked to the cabin window. Snow had stopped falling, and moonlight turned the wilderness silver. Somewhere out there, a woman and her baby were in terrible danger. Maybe they were already dead, but maybe, just maybe, they were still alive and waiting for someone to care enough to help. He strapped on his snowshoes and stepped into the frozen night. Sacred Bear Rock was 500 miles away through the most dangerous territory in Colorado. He had no horse, no supplies, and winter was far from over. But Serafina's words echoed in his mind like a prayer he couldn't ignore. Zeke Thornfield was about to begin the journey that would either save 2 innocent lives or kill him trying. Zeke's first step into the snow nearly killed him. The ground gave way beneath his snowshoes, and he plunged waist-deep into a hidden drift. Icy wind cut through his coat like knives, and already he could feel his body heat escaping. This was madness. No sane man would attempt a 500-mile journey in these conditions. But as he pulled himself out of the snow, Serafina's words rang in his ears. Please find my baby. Please tell her I loved her. He trudged forward through the night, following game trails that twisted between towering pine trees. Every few miles, he stopped to rest and reread parts of the diary by moonlight. Serafina had been so careful to hide her real destination. She wrote about heading east toward Kansas, but Zeke noticed small details that didn't match. She mentioned the smell of sage and juniper, plants that only grew in certain areas. She described rock formations that existed only near Sacred Bear Rock. By dawn, Zeke had traveled only 8 miles, but he understood Serafina's plan better. She was brilliant. While Grimsby's men chased false trails, she had taken the most dangerous route possible. Through Comanche territory, across rivers that froze solid in winter, over mountain passes that claimed lives even in summer. She chose death by nature over death by Grimsby's bullets. The diary revealed more about her past as Zeke walked. Serafina came from Moneyback in Philadelphia. Her father owned textile mills, and she had grown up wearing silk dresses and eating fancy meals. But she fell in love with a poor Irish immigrant named Finn O'Malley who worked on the railroad. When her father found out, he disowned her completely. She married Finn anyway and followed him west, trading her comfortable life for a tiny cabin and beans for dinner. Zeke stopped reading and looked around at the wilderness surrounding him. Serafina had given up everything for love, just like his own wife Martha had done. Martha came from a wealthy family in Denver, but she chose to marry a mountain man and live in a one-room cabin without running water or electricity. She never complained, not even when winter lasted 6 months and they ate nothing but dried meat and canned beans. The memory made his chest tight, but he kept walking. By afternoon, he reached the first real test of his journey. Copper Creek stretched 40 feet across, with water moving fast enough to sweep away a full-grown man. Ice covered the edges, but the center ran black and deep. Zeke studied the current and remembered what his Cheyenne friend Running Wolf had taught him years ago. Never trust ice that looks perfect. It's usually the thinnest. He found a fallen log upstream and used it to test the ice as he crossed. Halfway across, he heard a crack like thunder. The ice shifted beneath his feet, and freezing water soaked through his boots. He lunged forward and rolled onto solid ground just as the ice gave way completely. Behind him, chunks of ice spun in the current like broken teeth. That night, Zeke made camp in a grove of aspens and built a small fire. He dried his boots and socks while reading more of Serafina's story. Her husband Finn had been the railroad worker who discovered Grimsby's crimes. The diary described their last conversation in heartbreaking detail. Finn knew he was in danger, but he couldn't let Grimsby steal tribal land and destroy innocent families. He kissed me goodbye that morning like he knew it would be the last time, Serafina had written. I begged him to run away with me, but he said some things are more important than staying alive. I used to think he was foolish. Now I understand. Some fights choose you. Zeke stared into the fire and thought about fights that choose you. He had chosen the safe life after Martha died. He avoided people, avoided problems, avoided caring about anything except staying alive one more day. But Serafina's story was pulling him back into the world of the living, back into caring about something bigger than himself. He closed the diary and checked his supplies. 2 days of dried meat, enough coffee for maybe a week, and bullets for his rifle. Not nearly enough for a 500-mile journey, but he would figure it out as he went. Mountain men learned to live on what they could find, hunt, or trade. As he settled into his bedroll, Zeke made a promise to the stars above. He would find Sacred Bear Rock. He would learn what happened to Serafina and her baby. And if Cornelius Grimsby or his men had hurt them, they would pay the price that justice demanded. On his 3rd day of travel, Zeke discovered he wasn't alone in the wilderness. Fresh horse tracks crossed his path, and the riders were moving fast. Too fast for trappers or traders. These were men with urgent business, and Zeke had a sinking feeling he knew what that business was. He crouched beside the tracks and studied them carefully. For horses, all shod with iron shoes. Richmond's horses, Grimsby's men. The tracks were only hours old, heading in the same direction Zeke was traveling. His stomach twisted as he realized what this meant. Either they had found new clues about Serafina's real destination, or they were following him. He looked back at his own trail through the snow and cursed silently. His snowshoe tracks were as easy to follow as a road. Zeke changed direction and headed toward higher ground where rocky slopes would hide his tracks. As he climbed, he continued reading the diary, and Serafina's story grew more desperate with each page. She wrote about constant fear, about jumping at every sound and sleeping with one eye open. But she also wrote about her growing love for the child she carried. I felt the baby move today for the first time. One entry read, like a butterfly trying to escape from inside me. I pressed my hand to my belly and promised her I would keep her safe. I don't know how I know it's a girl, but I do. I've decided to name her Hope because that's all I have left. The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. Martha had felt their baby move just like that. She would grab his hand and place it on her stomach so he could feel the tiny kicks and rolls. They had planned to name their daughter Hope too. The coincidence felt like a message from beyond the grave. By evening, Zeke reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below. What he saw there made his blood turn to ice. A campfire flickered in the distance, and 4 men sat around it. Even from half a mile away, he could see they were well equipped with good horses, warm coats, and plenty of supplies. These weren't struggling travelers. They were professionals. Zeke pulled out an old spyglass his grandfather had given him and studied the camp more carefully. One man wore a long black coat and expensive boots. Another had the build and scars of someone who made his living with violence. The third man appeared to be tracking expert, constantly studying the ground and pointing in different directions. The fourth was cleaning a rifle with the practiced movements of a killer. They were discussing something intensely, passing around what looked like a piece of paper. Zeke's heart sank as he realized it was probably a map or maybe even pages from another diary. Had Seraphina kept more than one journal? Had she hidden clues somewhere that Grimsby's men had discovered? As darkness fell, Zeke watched the men settle in for the night. They took turns standing guard, which confirmed his worst fears. These were serious men doing serious work. They weren't just tracking Seraphina for money. This was personal for someone, and Zeke suspected that someone was Cornelius Grimsby himself. He made a cold camp that night, not daring to light a fire. Instead, he wrapped himself in his heaviest blanket and continued reading by moonlight. Seraphina's journal entries from her final weeks painted a picture of a woman pushed to her absolute limits. She wrote about eating bark and pine needles when she ran out of food. She described hiding in caves while men with dogs searched for her trail. She told of nights so cold she thought she would freeze to death before morning. But the most heartbreaking entries were her letters to her unborn daughter. Page after page of hopes and dreams and apologies for the world she was bringing her into. "I'm sorry you'll never know your father," she wrote. "He was the bravest, kindest man who ever lived. He died fighting for what was right, and I hope someday you'll understand why that mattered more than staying safe." Zeke wiped frost from his mustache and looked down at the camp below. The guard had changed, but the men were still there, still hunting. He realized that saving Seraphina and her baby wasn't just about outrunning these killers. It was about outsmarting them. And to do that, he needed to think like Seraphina had thought. She was always one step ahead because she understood something important. Grimsby's men expected her to act like a scared, helpless woman. Instead, she acted like a warrior protecting her young. She took risks they would never expect. She chose paths they would consider impossible. Zeke closed the diary and made his decision. If he followed the obvious route to Sacred Bear Rock, these men would catch him for sure. But if he followed Seraphina's example and chose the impossible path, he might have a chance. There was an old Cheyenne trail through Devil's Canyon that most people considered impassable in winter. It would add 3 days to his journey, but it might also save his life. As he prepared to descend the far side of the ridge, Zeke took one last look at the camp below. For men with horses and supplies against one man on foot, the odds were terrible, but Seraphina had faced worse odds and survived for months. If a pregnant woman could outrun trained killers, maybe an old mountain man could too. Devil's Canyon earned its name honestly. Zeke stood at the edge of the cliff and stared down into what looked like the earth's open wound. Jagged rocks jutted from the canyon walls like broken bones, and the bottom disappeared into shadow so deep it seemed to swallow light itself. The Cheyenne Trail was barely visible, carved into the rock face like a scar. One wrong step would send him falling 300 feet to certain death. But as Zeke studied the treacherous path, he discovered something that changed everything. Fresh scratches marked the rock walls. Someone had passed this way recently, using metal tools to chip handholds in the stone. His pulse quickened as he realized what this meant. Serafina had come this way. She had risked this impossible climb while carrying a child, driven by desperation stronger than fear. He began his descent as the sun reached its peak, knowing he would need every hour of daylight to reach the bottom safely. The first 50 feet went smoothly, following clear footholds carved by ancient hands. But then the trail narrowed to barely 12 inches wide, with nothing but empty air on one side and smooth rock on the other. Halfway down, Zeke found proof that Serafina had made this climb. A piece of blue fabric hung from a sharp outcrop, torn from a dress by someone moving in desperate haste. He touched the cloth gently and imagined the courage it must have taken for a woman in her condition to attempt something this dangerous. She could have fallen and killed both herself and her baby, but staying on safer ground meant certain death at the hands of Grimsby's men. The descent took 6 hours, and by the time Zeke reached the canyon floor, his hands were bloody and his legs shook with exhaustion. But he had escaped Grimsby's hunters, at least for now. The canyon bottom was a different world, protected from wind and snow by towering walls. A thin stream ran between smooth stones, and the air felt surprisingly warm. Zeke made camp beside the stream and treated his cut hands while reading more of Serafina's diary. Her entries from this period revealed new depths to her character that amazed him. She wasn't just running blindly anymore. She had developed a strategy, a plan that went far beyond simple survival. "I've been thinking about what Finn would want me to do," she wrote. "He died because he couldn't stand by and watch innocent people suffer. Maybe I can't stop Grimsby with guns or laws, but I can make sure the truth survives. I've hidden copies of the documents Finn found in 3 different places. Even if they kill me, someday someone will find the evidence and expose what Grimsby has done." Zeke sat up straighter as he read this. Serafina had hidden evidence, real proof of Grimsby's crimes. But where? He read on, searching for clues, and found them scattered throughout her later entries. She mentioned a place where eagles nest among the clouds. She wrote about the tree that grows from solid stone. She described water that flows upward toward the sky. These weren't random observations. They were landmarks, carefully chosen because they would mean something to the right person, but nothing to Grimsby's men. Zeke had lived in these mountains for 8 years. He knew every unusual rock formation, every strange tree, every waterfall that seemed to defy gravity. Serafina was leaving him a treasure map written in the language of the wilderness. As night fell, Zeke heard something that made his blood freeze. Voices echoed from high above, distorted by the canyon walls, but unmistakably human. Grimsby's men had found the canyon entrance. They were arguing about whether to attempt the descent in darkness or wait for morning. "She couldn't have come this way," one voice called down. "No woman would be crazy enough to try that climb." "Grimsby said she's smarter than we think," another voice replied, "and crazy enough to do anything to protect her kid. We go down at first light." Zeke realized he had maybe 6 hours before they started down the trail. The canyon stretched for miles in both directions, but he knew from the diary that Serafina had headed east towards Sacred Bear Rock. He would have to move fast and hope that his knowledge of the terrain gave him enough advantage to stay ahead. But first, he wanted to understand more about the evidence Serafina had hidden. He reread her cryptic clues by firelight, matching them with his mental map of the region. Eagles nest among the clouds probably meant Eagle's Peak, the highest mountain within 50 miles of Sacred Bear Rock. The tree that grows from solid stone sounded like the ancient pine that grew from a crack in Granite Falls. And water that flows upward toward the sky could only be the natural spring that shot water 30 feet into the air near the Cheyenne sacred grounds. Serafina had hidden evidence at 3 locations forming a triangle around Sacred Bear Rock. If Zeke could reach those hiding places and recover the documents, he could prove Grimsby's crimes even if he was too late to save Serafina and her baby. The truth would survive, and justice might still be possible. He packed his few belongings and started walking east through the canyon. Above him, stars shone like scattered diamonds between the rock walls. Somewhere ahead, a woman and child were counting on him to care enough to finish what they had started. Behind him, Killers prepared for a dawn hunt that would determine whether truth or corruption triumphed. Zeke Thornfield was no longer just trying to save 2 lives. He was racing to preserve evidence that could change everything. Zeke walked through the night, following the stream as it wound deeper into the canyon. By dawn, he had covered 12 miles and found the eastern exit, a narrow gap between towering walls that opened onto rolling hills covered in pine and aspen. He was exhausted, hungry, and his water was running low, but he had gained precious time on his pursuers. The diary's next entries revealed a side of Serafina that broke his heart. As her pregnancy advanced and her situation grew more desperate, she began writing letters to people she would never see again. Letters to her sister back in Philadelphia, apologizing for choices that brought shame to the family. Letters to Finn's mother in Ireland, describing how much she loved her son and how brave he had been. Letters to the baby she carried, full of advice and love and desperate hope. "My darling Hope," one letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't survive to raise you myself. I want you to know that every choice I made was to give you a chance at life. Your father died fighting for justice, and I've spent these months running to keep you safe. Don't let anyone tell you that we were criminals. We were just people who couldn't stay silent when we saw evil happening." Zeke stopped walking and wiped his eyes. The words reminded him of things Martha used to say about bringing children into a hard world. She believed that love could overcome any obstacle, that good people had a responsibility to fight for what was right even when it cost them everything. Reading Serafina's words felt like hearing Martha's voice again. But the diary also revealed something troubling. Serafina's handwriting was becoming shaky and uneven. She wrote about feeling dizzy and weak, about pain in her back and stomach. She was getting sick, and Zeke knew enough about mountain survival to recognize the signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. She had been pushing herself beyond human limits for months, and her body was finally breaking down. "I felt the baby move less today," one entry read. "I'm scared something is wrong, but I can't stop now. We're so close to Sacred Bear Rock. The Cheyenne will help us if we can just reach them." Running Wolf promised Finn that his people would protect any friend who came to them in need. Zeke's heart jumped at the mention of Running Wolf. He was the same Cheyenne warrior who had taught Zeke wilderness survival years ago. If Running Wolf had promised protection to Finn's family, he would keep that promise even if it cost him his life. The Cheyenne took such oaths seriously. By midday, Zeke reached the first of Serafina's hiding places. Eagle's Peak rose before him like a stone giant, its summit lost in clouds. The trail to the top was treacherous even in good weather, but Serafina had somehow made the climb while sick and pregnant. Every step of this journey showed him new depths of her courage and determination. The climb took 4 hours, and Zeke's lungs burned in the thin air as he approached the summit. Near the top, he found an eagle's nest built into a crack in the rock face. The birds were gone for the winter, but something else occupied their home now. A small leather pouch, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and wedged deep into the nest where only someone who knew exactly where to look would find it. Inside the pouch, Zeke discovered papers that made his hands shake. Railroad documents showing how Grimsby had forged government signatures to steal thousands of acres of tribal land. Bank records proving he had bribed judges and politicians to look the other way. Most damaging of all, a confession written in Finn O'Malley's careful handwriting, describing everything he had witnessed and naming every person involved in Grimsby's criminal empire. But there was something else in the pouch that hit Zeke even harder. A small silver locket containing a photograph of Serafina and Finn on their wedding day. She was radiant in a simple white dress, and he looked proud enough to burst. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "For our daughter, so she'll know how much love created her." Zeke carefully rewrapped the documents and tucked them into his coat. This evidence could destroy Grimsby and everyone who worked for him, but only if it reached honest lawmen who couldn't be bought or threatened. He would need to survive the next few days and find a way to get these papers to someone trustworthy. As he started down the mountain, movement in the valley below caught his attention. For riders were following the stream eastward, moving fast despite the difficult terrain. Grimsby's men had made it through Devil's Canyon and were closing the distance. Zeke estimated they were maybe 6 hours behind him now, and they had horses while he was on foot. The second hiding place was still 30 miles away, and Zeke knew he couldn't outrun mounted men much longer. He needed a new strategy, something that would slow down his pursuers or throw them off his trail entirely. As he descended Eagle's Peak, an idea began forming in his mind. It was dangerous and would require perfect timing, but it might be his only chance. Near the base of the mountain, Zeke found what he was looking for. A narrow pass between two hills where the trail was barely wide enough for one horse at a time. Above the pass, loose rocks balanced precariously on steep slopes, held in place by tree roots and packed snow. It would take careful work, but he might be able to create a rock slide that would block the pass for days. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing his trap, using techniques Running Wolf had taught him for hunting large game. By evening, everything was ready. Now he just had to hope that Grimsby's men would arrive at the right time and that his plan would work without getting him killed in the process. Zeke crouched behind a boulder on the hillside above the narrow pass, watching the trail below. The sun was setting, painting the snow orange and red, and he was beginning to wonder if his plan had failed. Maybe Grimsby's men had taken a different route, or maybe they had stopped to make camp for the night. Then he heard the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the rocks. For riders approached the pass in single file, moving cautiously through the gathering darkness. The man in the lead held up his hand, and they all stopped just outside the narrow gap between the hills. Zeke's heart sank as he realized they suspected a trap. These weren't ordinary hired guns. They were experienced hunters who had survived by being careful. Something feels wrong about this place, the lead rider called back to his companions. Too perfect for an ambush. He dismounted and walked forward on foot, studying the ground for signs of disturbance. Zeke held his breath and gripped the rope he had tied to a key support log. Everything depended on timing now. The tracker knelt and examined the trail more closely. After what felt like hours, he stood up and shook his head. "Trail's clean," he announced. "She came through here, but there's no sign of recent activity." He remounted his horse and waved the others forward. "Stay alert anyway. That woman's been smarter than we expected every step of the way." The first rider entered the pass. Then the second. Zeke waited until all four men were strung out in the narrow gap before pulling his rope as hard as he could. The support log shifted, and tons of loose rock and snow began sliding down the hillside. The rumble started low, like distant thunder, then grew to a roar that shook the ground. "Rock slide," one of the men shouted, spurring his horse forward desperately. But there was nowhere to go. The avalanche hit them like the fist of an angry mountain god, burying the pass under 20 feet of stone and debris. When the dust settled, silence returned to the valley. Zeke scrambled down the hillside to see what had happened. 3 of the horses had escaped, riderless and terrified, galloping back the way they had come. But he could see one man's arm sticking out from under the rocks, motionless. The others might be trapped but alive, or they might be crushed beyond help. He felt sick at the thought of killing men, even men who were hunting an innocent woman and her baby. But he couldn't afford to feel guilty now. The rock slide had bought him time, maybe days if the other hunters decided to go around instead of trying to dig through. He gathered his few possessions and headed east toward the second hiding place, following Seraphina's trail by moonlight. As he walked, Zeke continued reading the diary, and what he discovered made him move even faster. Seraphina's condition was deteriorating rapidly in her final entries. She wrote about bleeding that wouldn't stop and pain that made her double over. Most frightening of all, she mentioned hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there. "The baby hasn't moved in 2 days." One entry read in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. "I'm scared she's already gone, but I can't give up now. I have to reach Running Wolf. He'll know what to do. He has to know what to do because I can't do this alone anymore." Zeke pushed himself harder, ignoring his exhaustion and the protests from his aching legs. Seraphina had been dying when she wrote those words, but she had still been moving towards Sacred Bear Rock. If she had collapsed somewhere along the trail, her body might still be there, protected by the cold. And if by some miracle she was still alive. He reached Granite Falls just after midnight. The ancient pine tree that grew from solid stone stood exactly where he remembered it, its massive trunk emerging from a crack in the cliff face, like nature's own miracle. But finding Seraphina's second cache proved more difficult than expected. She had hidden it well, and it took him an hour of searching before he discovered the hollow space behind the tree's roots. This pouch contained even more explosive evidence. Letters between Grimsby and government officials discussing the Indian problem and how to clear the land for profitable development. Maps showing planned railroad routes through tribal territory that hadn't been made public yet. Most damning of all, a list of names and payment amounts for every person Grimsby had bribed, threatened, or killed to build his empire. But there was also something personal that made Zeke's throat tight with emotion. A small baby dress that Seraphina had sewn by hand during her months of running. It was made from pieces of her own clothing, carefully stitched together with loving attention to every detail. She had embroidered tiny flowers along the collar and hem, creating something beautiful for a daughter who might never get to wear it. Zeke tucked the dress carefully into his coat, next to the other evidence. Even if he was too late to save Seraphina and her baby, he would make sure the world knew how much love had gone into trying to protect them. These weren't the belongings of a criminal running from justice. These were the treasures of a mother fighting to give her child a future. Dawn was breaking as he left Granite Falls and headed toward the final hiding place. The natural spring that shot water toward the sky was only 15 miles from Sacred Bear Rock, which meant he was getting close to the end of Seraphina's journey. But it also meant he was running out of time. The diary's final entries suggested she had been barely conscious when she reached the Cheyenne territory. As Zeke climbed toward higher ground, he saw something in the distance that made his heart race. Smoke rising from the direction of Sacred Bear Rock. Not the thin white smoke of a normal campfire, but thick black smoke that spoke of destruction and violence. He began running despite his exhaustion, driven by a terrible certainty that he was about to discover the truth he had been dreading all along. The smell of burned timber and something much worse reached Zeke long before he could see Sacred Bear Rock clearly. He approached the Cheyenne camp from the south, moving carefully through pine trees that provided cover. What he found when he reached the edge of the clearing made him fall to his knees in horror. The entire village had been destroyed. Traditional lodges lay in smoking ruins, their buffalo hide walls blackened and torn. Cooking pots and tools were scattered across the ground like broken teeth. But most terrible of all were the bodies. Men, women, and children cut down by bullets and left where they fell. The massacre had been thorough and merciless. Zeke forced himself to walk through the devastation, looking for any sign of survivors. He found Running Wolf near the center of the camp, his body riddled with bullet holes, but his face still defiant even in death. The old warrior had died fighting, probably trying to protect someone else. His war paint was smeared with blood, but his grip on his tomahawk remained strong. Near Running Wolf's body, Zeke discovered something that made his hands shake. Fresh footprints in the mud, much smaller than a man's boots. A woman's footprints, heading away from the camp toward the sacred spring. Seraphina had been here when the attack happened. She had seen this slaughter, and somehow she had escaped. But the footprints told a grim story. They wavered and stumbled, sometimes showing where she had fallen and struggled back to her feet. Drops of blood marked the trail every few yards, growing larger and more frequent as they led toward the spring. She was badly wounded and losing strength fast. Zeke followed the bloody trail with growing urgency. The sacred spring lay in a small valley beyond the camp, surrounded by standing stones that the Cheyenne believed held spiritual power. As he crested the hill overlooking the valley, he saw her. Seraphina Blackwood sat beside the spring with her back against one of the ancient stones. Even from a distance, he could see she was dying. Her blue dress was stained with blood, and her face was pale as winter snow. But she was alive, and she was holding something in her arms. A small bundle wrapped in the baby dress Zeke had found at Granite Falls. He ran down the hill toward her, calling out so she wouldn't be frightened. "Seraphina, my name is Zeke Thornfield. I found your diary. I'm here to help you." She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see through him to something beyond the physical world. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the spring. I knew someone would come. I prayed someone would come. Zeke knelt beside her and saw immediately how bad her condition was. She had been shot in the side, and the wound was infected. Fever burned in her cheeks, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. But the bundle in her arms was moving slightly, and he heard the faint sound of a baby crying. Is she alive? He asked, hardly daring to hope. Seraphina's face lit up with a smile that transformed her completely. Despite the pain and exhaustion, despite everything she had endured, she looked radiant with joy. She's beautiful, she whispered. Perfect and beautiful and strong, just like her father. She carefully pulled back the cloth to reveal a tiny face surrounded by dark hair. The baby was thin and weak, but her eyes were bright and alert. She had survived everything her mother had been through, protected by love more powerful than bullets or cold or starvation. I named her Hope, Seraphina continued, her voice growing weaker. Hope Martha O'Malley. Martha was my mother's name, but it's also a good name for someone who brings light into dark places. Zeke's heart stopped. Martha. She had named the baby Martha. It felt like a message from his dead wife, a sign that he was meant to be here at this moment. It's a beautiful name, he managed to say around the lump in his throat. Seraphina struggled to sit up straighter. The men who did this, they work for Cornelius Grimsby. They found the camp yesterday and demanded that Running Wolf turn me over to them. When he refused, they started shooting. Everyone died trying to protect me and Hope. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small key. The third cache is hidden in the spring itself, in a metal box chained to the rocks underwater. This key opens it. The evidence inside will destroy Grimsby if it reaches the right people. Promise me you'll make sure the truth comes out. Zeke took the key and nodded. I promise. But first we need to get you to a doctor. There's a settlement about 50 miles south of here. Seraphina shook her head weakly. I'm not going to make it that far. We both know that. But Hope can survive if you take care of her. She's strong, stronger than I ever imagined possible. She looked down at her daughter with infinite tenderness. She's going to change the world someday. I can feel it. The baby began crying more loudly, and Seraphina tried to comfort her. But her movements were growing sluggish, and Zeke could see she was fading fast. He had arrived just in time to witness the end of an incredible journey, but perhaps just in time to ensure that it wasn't the end of the story. Tell me about the men who did this, he said urgently. How many were there? Which way did they go? Seraphina's eyes focused on him with effort. 8 men, maybe more. They rode north after the attack, probably heading back to Grimsby's ranch. But they'll be back when they realize I escaped. They won't give up until... Her voice trailed off as another wave of pain washed over her. Seraphina's breathing became more labored as the afternoon wore on, but she refused to rest. She spent every conscious moment telling Zeke about her daughter, sharing memories and hopes as if she could somehow transfer a lifetime of love in just a few hours. She described how Hope responded to different sounds, how she preferred to be held, what seemed to comfort her when she cried. She likes it when you hum, Seraphina whispered, demonstrating with a soft melody that made the baby's eyes close peacefully. And she's curious about everything. She'll turn her head toward any new sound. She's going to be smart, just like her father. Zeke listened to every word, understanding that he was receiving instructions for caring for this child. Seraphina was preparing him to become Hope's protector, even though they had known each other for less than a day. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but also somehow right. This was why he had found the diary. This was why he had traveled 500 miles through impossible conditions. As evening approached, Seraphina's strength faded visibly. But she had one more task to complete. Help me to the spring, she said, struggling to stand. I need to show you exactly where the final evidence is hidden. Zeke supported her as they walked the few yards to the water's edge. The natural spring shot a column of crystal-clear water 15 feet into the air, creating a constant shower that had carved smooth pools in the surrounding rocks. Seraphina pointed to a specific formation near the base of the main spout. There's a chain anchored to that large rock underwater, she explained. Follow it down about 8 feet, and you'll find a metal strongbox. Inside are the original documents Finn died trying to protect, plus letters from other railroad workers who witnessed Grimsby's crimes. Everything you need to bring him to justice. Zeke studied the pool carefully, memorizing the landmarks she described. The water was ice-cold and crystal clear, but diving 8 feet down in winter temperatures would be dangerous. Still, recovering that evidence was essential if Hope was going to grow up in a world where her parents' sacrifice meant something. There's something else, Serafina continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I wrote letters to my sister in Philadelphia. Her name is Catherine Blackwood Hartley, and she lives on Rittenhouse Square. If anything happens to me, she would take care of Hope. She has money and connections, and she could give her a good life. Zeke felt a stab of unexpected pain at these words. He had already begun thinking of himself as Hope's protector, but Serafina was right. A wealthy family in Philadelphia could provide education, security, and opportunities that a mountain man never could. Still, the thought of giving up this child felt like losing Martha and his own daughter all over again. But I want you to decide, Serafina added, reading his expression correctly. You're the one who cared enough to come looking for us. You're the one who risked everything to help strangers. Hope needs someone who will love her that much. She reached into her dress one final time and pulled out a sealed letter. This explains everything to Catherine. Who Hope is, what happened to us, and why someone needed to care for her. Whatever you decide about her future, make sure she knows the truth about her parents. As darkness fell, Zeke built a small fire using dry wood he found near the spring. Serafina was too weak to hold Hope safely, so he cradled the baby while she rested against the standing stone. The little girl seemed remarkably calm considering everything she had been through. She watched the firelight dance with bright, intelligent eyes that reminded him painfully of Martha's. I need to tell you something, Serafina said suddenly, her voice urgent despite her exhaustion. Grimsby's men will come back. They have to kill Hope to keep their secret safe. A child can't testify in court, but she's still a witness to what they did to her father. As long as she's alive, she's a threat to everything Grimsby has built. The words sent ice through Zeke's veins. He had been thinking about justice and evidence and legal proceedings, but Serafina was right. This wasn't just about bringing criminals to trial. This was about keeping a baby alive long enough to grow up and tell her story. How much time do we have? He asked. Not much. They probably expected to find my body in the Cheyenne camp. When they realize I escaped, they'll send trackers to hunt down my trail. Maybe a day, maybe less. Serafina closed her eyes and seemed to gather her remaining strength. There's a cabin about 20 miles southeast of here. Old trapper named Jonas Whitehawk built it before the railroad came through. He might help you, or at least let you rest there. Zeke knew the cabin she meant. Jonas had disappeared 2 years ago, probably killed by a bear or claimed by the harsh winter. But the cabin was still standing, and it would provide better shelter than sleeping in the open with a newborn baby. I'll leave at first light, he decided. Get Hope somewhere safe, then come back for the evidence in the spring. Serafina shook her head weakly. No time. They could be here by morning. You have to choose, Zeke. Save the evidence or save my daughter. You can't do both. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. The evidence could destroy Grimsby and prevent him from hurting other families. But Hope was an innocent baby who deserved a chance at life. As he looked down at her sleeping face, peaceful despite everything she had endured, Zeke realized there was really no choice at all. Zeke made his choice in the darkness before dawn. He couldn't save both the evidence and the baby, but he refused to accept that Hope had to die for Grimsby's crimes to be exposed. There had to be another way, something Serafina hadn't thought of in her weakened condition. He just needed time to figure out what it was. Serafina had died peacefully during the night, slipping away while Hope slept in Zeke's arms. He found her in the morning with a smile on her face, finally free from months of pain and fear. Before leaving, he wrapped her body in his warmest blanket and said words over her grave that he hoped would reach whatever place good souls went after such suffering. You did everything right, he whispered to the morning sky. Your daughter is safe now, and the world will know the truth about what you sacrificed. I promise. He fashioned a carrier for Hope from his pack and extra clothing, creating a warm nest where she could ride against his chest. The baby seemed to understand that everything had changed. She rarely cried and watched the world around them with solemn eyes that seemed far too old for such a tiny face. The journey to Jonas Whitehawk's cabin took 14 hours through deep snow and bitter cold. Zeke stopped every few miles to check on Hope, making sure she was warm and breathing normally. He had no experience caring for babies, but instinct guided him. When she cried, he held her close and hummed the melody Serafina had taught him. When she seemed restless, he talked to her about the mountains and trees, describing everything they passed, as if she could understand every word. The cabin appeared just as the sun was setting, a small dark shape against the white landscape. It was in better condition than Zeke had expected, with the roof intact and the door still hanging properly. Inside, he found evidence that Jonas had left in a hurry. Clothes still hung on pegs, and canned food lined shelves built into the walls. Most importantly, there was a good supply of firewood and a stove that still worked. Zeke got a fire going and melted snow for clean water while Hope slept in her makeshift carrier. He had no milk for her, but he remembered his grandmother talking about feeding babies sugar water when their mothers couldn't nurse. It wasn't ideal, but it might keep her alive until he could find a proper solution. As he prepared the sugar water, using the last of his coffee supply, Zeke's mind worked on the larger problem. Grimsby's men would track them here eventually. The cabin provided temporary shelter, but it wasn't a permanent solution. He needed help, and he needed it from someone powerful enough to stand up to a wealthy railroad baron. That's when he remembered something Serafina had mentioned in her diary. A federal marshal named Samuel Harrison who had been asking questions about missing tribal land documents. Harrison was supposedly one of the few lawmen who couldn't be bought, and he had been investigating Grimsby's activities from Denver. If Zeke could somehow get word to him. But first, he had to retrieve the evidence from the sacred spring. The documents in that underwater strongbox were the only proof of Grimsby's crimes that existed. Without them, Hope would spend her entire life running from men who wanted her dead. With them, she could grow up free and safe, knowing her parents' deaths had meaning. Zeke spent the night planning an approach that might work. He would leave Hope hidden in the cabin and make a quick trip back to the spring. If he traveled light and moved fast, he could cover the 20 miles in one day, retrieve the evidence, and return before anyone found the cabin. It was risky, but every option was risky now. Dawn brought the sound he had been dreading. Horses approaching through the forest, moving slowly but steadily toward the cabin. Zeke grabbed his rifle and peered through a crack in the wall. 8 riders emerged from the trees, spreading out to surround the building. They moved with military precision, obviously experienced at this kind of work. The leader was a tall man in a black coat who dismounted and walked toward the cabin door with casual confidence. "Ezekiel Thornfield," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "My name is Marcus Colt, and I work for Mr. Cornelius Grimsby. We know you're in there with the woman's child." Zeke's blood turned to ice. They knew his name. Somehow, Grimsby had learned exactly who was helping Serafina, which meant this was no longer a random hunt. This was personal. "Mr. Grimsby wants to make you an offer," Colt continued. "Give us the child and any documents you might have found, and you can walk away from this with enough gold to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Refuse, and we'll burn this cabin down around you." Hope stirred in her carrier, making soft baby sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Zeke touched her tiny hand gently, drawing strength from her trust in him. She had no idea what was happening, but she was depending on him to keep her safe. "You've got 1 minute to decide," Colt shouted. "After that, we start shooting." Zeke checked his rifle and counted his ammunition. 12 bullets against 8 armed men. The odds were impossible, but he had faced impossible odds before. Sometimes a man had to make a stand regardless of the consequences. Sometimes protecting innocent life was more important than surviving. He thought about Serafina's final words, about Hope growing up to change the world. He thought about Finn O'Malley dying to expose the truth about stolen land. He thought about Martha and the daughter he had lost, and how this moment felt like a chance to honor their memory. "Go to hell, Colt," he called back, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "You want this baby? You'll have to come through me first." The first shots shattered the morning silence, and Zeke Thornfield prepared to fight the most important battle of his life. Bullets splintered the cabin walls as Zeke dove behind an overturned table, clutching hope against his chest. The baby began crying, her tiny voice almost lost in the roar of gunfire. He had maybe 30 seconds before Grimsby's men rushed the door, and 12 bullets to stop 8 killers. The math was simple and terrifying. But Zeke had one advantage his enemies didn't expect. He knew these mountains better than any man alive, and Jonas Whitehawk had built his cabin with more than one way out. While Colt's men concentrated their fire on the front wall, Zeke crawled toward the back corner where Jonas had cut a hidden exit for emergencies. The narrow opening led to a root cellar that connected to a natural cave system. Zeke had explored these caves years ago and remembered they stretched for miles underground. If he could reach them with hope, they might have a chance to escape. But first he had to create enough confusion to cover their movements. He fired 3 quick shots through the front window, then immediately moved to a different position and fired 3 more. The attackers would think there were multiple defenders inside, which might make them more cautious about rushing the building. Every minute of delay increased their chances of getting away. Hope's crying grew louder, and Zeke realized she was hungry and frightened. He whispered gentle words as he crawled toward the hidden exit, promising her that everything would be all right even though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. She seemed to calm at the sound of his voice, her tiny hand gripping his finger with surprising strength. The hidden door opened into darkness that smelled of earth and old wood. Zeke squeezed through the narrow opening with hope pressed against his chest, then carefully closed the entrance behind them. Above, he could hear Colt shouting orders to his men, preparing for a final assault on the cabin. The root cellar was barely large enough for a grown man to stand upright, but it connected to the cave system through a crack in the rock wall. Zeke had to remove his coat and push Hope through first, then squeeze through himself. The process took precious minutes, and he could hear gunfire intensifying above as Grimsby's men realized their quarry was escaping. The caves were pitch black and cold as a tomb, but Zeke knew them well enough to navigate by feel. He moved as quickly as he dared, one hand touching the wall for guidance, and the other protecting Hope from bumps and scrapes. Behind them, voices echoed from the root cellar as someone discovered their escape route. "They're in the caves," a man shouted. "Colt wants them alive if possible, but dead will do." Footsteps and torchlight followed them into the darkness, but Zeke had a crucial head start and superior knowledge of the terrain. He led them through a series of twisting passages that grew narrower and more treacherous with each turn. Most of Grimsby's men were too large to follow through the tightest spaces, which bought additional time. After an hour of underground travel, they emerged from a hidden entrance 3 miles from the cabin. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, and Zeke could see smoke rising from the direction they had come. Colt had probably burned the cabin out of frustration when he realized his quarry had escaped. But they weren't safe yet. Grimsby's men would spread out and search every possible hiding place within a 50-mile radius. Zeke needed to reach civilization and find someone in authority who could protect Hope while exposing the truth about her parents' deaths. The nearest settlement was Copper Creek, a mining town 60 miles southeast where a federal marshal might have jurisdiction. The journey would take 3 days on foot through some of the most dangerous terrain in Colorado. Zeke had almost no supplies, a baby to care for, and killers hunting them every step of the way. But he also had something that gave him strength beyond his physical limits. He had a purpose that mattered more than his own survival. As they started down the mountain, Hope fell asleep against his chest, lulled by the rhythm of his walking. She trusted him completely, this tiny person who had already survived more hardship than most adults ever faced. Her peaceful breathing reminded him of all the reasons he had to succeed. The first day passed without incident, but on the second morning, Zeke spotted riders in the distance. 3 men moving in a pattern that suggested they were searching for tracks. He hid in a grove of aspen trees until they passed, then changed direction to avoid their search grid. By the third day, Hope was growing weak from hunger despite the sugar water he had been giving her. She needed real milk and proper food soon, or she wouldn't survive much longer. Zeke pushed himself harder, ignoring exhaustion and the protests from his aching body. They had to reach Copper Creek before it was too late. The town appeared just as the sun was setting on their third day of travel. Zeke had never been so happy to see civilization in his entire life. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and he could hear the sounds of people going about their evening routines. Somewhere in this community was help, protection, and hope for the future. He walked straight to the marshal's office, a small building with bars on the windows and a sign that read Federal Territory Law Enforcement. Inside, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a badge looked up from his paperwork. "Marshal Harrison?" Zeke asked, remembering the name from Seraphina's diary. "That's right. What can I do for you?" Zeke carefully unwrapped Hope and placed her on the marshal's desk, then reached into his coat for the evidence he had carried 500 miles. "My name is Ezekiel Thornfield, and this is Hope O'Malley. Her parents died trying to expose corruption that goes all the way to the top of the railroad company. I have proof of murder, bribery, and land theft that will bring down Cornelius Grimsby and everyone who works for him." Marshal Harrison looked at the documents, then at the baby, then back at Zeke. "Son," he said quietly, "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to bring me evidence like this. You just helped me close the biggest case of my career." Hope opened her eyes and looked around the room with curiosity, as if she knew that their long journey was finally over. She had lost her parents, but she had gained something else. A future where truth mattered more than money, where justice was possible even for the powerless, and where love could overcome the darkest evil. Zeke smiled as he watched her discover the warm, well-lit room that represented safety and new beginnings. Seraphina had been right. This little girl was going to change the world someday, and he would be there to watch her do it. Years later, when Hope O'Malley became the first woman elected to Congress from the state of Colorado, she would tell reporters that her greatest inspiration came from the man who carried her 500 miles to safety when she was too small to walk. But Zeke always insisted she had it backwards. She was the one who had saved him, giving his life meaning and purpose when he thought both were lost forever. Remember to hit that like button if this story touched your heart, and subscribe for more incredible true tales of courage, love, and the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Tomorrow, I'll share another story that proves heroes come in all shapes and sizes, often when we least expect them. Until then, keep believing that one person really can make a difference in this world.